Welcome to Grave Whispers. I've sifted through case files, newspaper clippings, and overlooked details to piece these stories together. Some of these cases you'll recognize, others you may not have heard of, but all hold something worth uncovering. What I've found isn't always neat, and it isn't always complete, but it's real, and now it's yours to hear. By 2005, forensic science had entered a new era. DNA testing was standard procedure in most police departments, fingerprint databases were digitalized, and advances in technology allowed investigators to connect crimes across cities and states in ways that once seemed impossible. But in Jennings, Louisiana, a small working-class town in Jefferson Davis Parish, those advancements might as well have been worlds away. When the first woman's body surfaced in a murky canal outside of town, investigators had same modern tools as any department in the country. What they lacked was accountability, oversight, and the will to use them. Over the next 4 years, 7 more women would die under eerily similar circumstances. Their bodies were found in ditches, canals, and fields, each discovery deepening the mystery while the investigation remained stagnant. Instead of answers, Jennings saw rumors. Instead of justice, the town watched those sworn to protect it fall under suspicion themselves. What began as a single tragedy evolved into a tangled web of corruption, addiction, and neglect, turning this quiet Louisiana town into the heart of one of the state's darkest and most disturbing unsolved cases. Jennings, Louisiana, sat quietly along the I-10 corridor, about halfway between the larger cities of Lafayette and Lake Charles. In the mid-2000s, its population hovered around 11,000. It was a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew someone, and that someone was connected to law enforcement, local politics, or the oil fields. On the surface, Jennings looked like many rural southern towns. There were modest homes, small churches on every corner, and a main street that seemed frozen in time. But underneath that surface, the town was struggling. The local economy leaned on small-scale retail, agriculture, and oilfield labor. Jobs were unstable, seasonal, and very often low-paying. Many of the residents worked long hours for a wage that barely covered rent or groceries. By 2005, nearly 1 in 5 families lived below the poverty line, and the lack of opportunity pushed many towards desperation. Abandoned businesses dotted the main highway. It was a silent reminder of an economy that had begun to hollow out years earlier. With few resources and little oversight, drugs became both an economy and an escape. Methamphetamine and cocaine moved easily through Jennings. They sold it in back rooms, trailer parks, and along dimly lit streets south of town. Addiction spread just as quick. It was infecting entire families and fueling cycles of poverty and crime. For some women, sex work became a matter of survival. It was a way to feed their children, to pay rent, or simply get through the week. Law enforcement knew most of these women by name, not as strangers, but as informants, addicts, or repeat arrestees. Many of those same names would later reappear in police files marked deceased. Behind the slow rhythm of a small-town life, Jennings was unraveling. Poverty, corruption, and addiction were not separate problems. They fed one another. By the time the first body was pulled from the canal, the town had already built the perfect conditions for tragedy. On May 20th, 2005, the first of 8 bodies was found, that of Loretta Lynn Scheisen Lewis. At only 28 years old, she was found in the Grand Marais Canal just outside of Jennings, Louisiana. Loretta was born and raised here, and she grew up in a working-class family, spent most of her life in South Jennings, an area known for its close-knit community, but also for its drugs and economic hardship. By her late teens, Loretta's life began to mirror the struggles that defined her neighborhood. She battled addiction and turned to sex work as a means of survival, often staying with friends or relatives when she couldn't afford rent. People who knew her described her as warm and talkative, someone who cared deeply for her family despite being caught in a cycle she couldn't break. Loretta frequented familiar spots in town, the Boudreaux Inn, small bars, and houses where drugs were exchanged and users looked out for one another. Many in that circle would later become victims themselves. Her cousin, Tracy Chison, and friends Ernestine Patterson and Laconia Muggy Brown moved in the same network of users, dealers, and informants known to local law enforcement. In early 2005, Loretta was trying to regain stability, talking about finding steady work and rebuilding ties with family. But her dependence on drugs and the environment she lived in made that difficult. She often interacted with police, both as a target of arrests and at times as an informant hoping for leniency. On May 17, 2005, 28-year-old Loretta Lynn Chison Lewis was seen alive for the last time in Jennings, Louisiana. Witnesses placed her at the Phillips 66 gas station, getting into a vehicle with Frankie Richard, a local drug dealer and pimp well known to both law enforcement and the women of South Jennings. Later that same evening, she was seen at the Boudreaux Inn, a rundown motel that served as a hub for drugs and sex work. Inside one of the rooms, she was reported using drugs with Jermaine Stymie Washington and Laconia Muggy Brown, as well as Nicole Guillory, two women who would later become victims themselves. Loretta's addiction had worsened in the months before her death. Her husband, Murphy Lewis, had persuaded her to seek treatment in 2004 after years of relapse, but the program failed. The couple separated, though they never divorced. Loretta drifted between motels, friends' homes, and dealers' places, part of that same tight and dangerous circuit that had already claimed lives in Jennings. 3 days after she was last seen on May 20th, 2005, a fisherman on the Grand Marais Canal, just outside of Jennings, noticed a body tangled in weeds and called authorities. The woman was face down, bloated, and unrecognizable. She wore blue jeans, a short-sleeved white blouse, but she didn't wear shoes. The scene was immediately sealed off, and deputies worked quietly. That same morning, Deputy Terry Guillory, the Jefferson Davis Parish Jail Warden, visited the home of Barbara "Barb" DeShotel, one of Loretta's closest friends and roommates. He asked when she had last seen Loretta. This visit struck Barb as strange because no missing persons report had been filed and no one had yet publicly connected a body to Loretta. After Guillory left, Barb phoned Loretta's brother Nick to tell him about the deputy's visit. Moments later, word began to spread around town that a body had been pulled from the canal. Nick and Barb drove to the scene and stopped at the police barricade on Riverside Road. From there, they watched as officers pulled the body from the water. Barb knew immediately who it was. She hadn't been told her friend was missing, but somehow the sheriff's office had known to ask about her before anyone else did. The body was soon identified by fingerprints as Loretta Lewis, 5'3", 104 pounds, with blonde brown hair. The coroner noted no visible external injuries except for a small patch of blood beneath her scalp. Her toxicology report revealed high levels of cocaine, Zoloft, Celexa, and alcohol with an ETOH of 0.16, ETOH being the ethanol level. Her cause of death was officially listed as undetermined, though the medical examiner cited mixed drug intoxication as a contributing factor. The estimated date of death was May 17, 2005, the same day she was last seen alive. Back home, Loretta's family waited for answers that never came. Her husband, Murphy Lewis, was furious when he learned that he had never been questioned by the investigators, despite being her spouse and the father of her 2 children. No one from the sheriff's office asked about her recent behavior, her contacts, or the days leading up to her disappearance. What surfaced instead were rumors. People whispered that Loretta had been involved with members of local law enforcement, that she had traded information for leniency, and that some of those relationships had crossed the line. Multiple witnesses, including one of her former cellmates, later stated that Loretta had a sexual relationship with Deputy Terry Guillory, who served as warden of the parish jail. Loretta herself had reportedly spoken openly about it, telling others she was having sex with the deputy at the time. Despite these claims, no formal investigation into her relationship with law enforcement was ever conducted. Her case file listed the cause of death as undetermined, her body was released to family, and then the case quietly closed. For a time, Loretta Lewis's death was treated as an isolated tragedy, the kind of loss people in Jennings had grown used to. The sheriff's office spoke little about the case, and the community quietly folded her name into the long list of women lost to drugs, poverty, and violence. Officially, there was no reason to believe her death was anything more than the result of a dangerous lifestyle. But on the streets of South Jennings, people weren't convinced. Loretta's name kept coming up in whispers. The strange behavior of local law enforcement, the speed with which her case was dismissed, and her known ties to both police and the drug world made many uneasy. And then, before the rumors could fade, another woman disappeared. Her name was Ernestine Marie Daniels Patterson, a 30-year-old from the same side of town struggling with the same demons and known to many of the same people. Like Loretta, she had served as a police informant, moved through the same hotels, back roads, and corners of the drug scene that connected half of the parish. When Ernestine's body was found in another canal just weeks later, it became impossible to ignore the pattern forming around Jennings. Whatever had happened to Loretta was not an accident. Something far darker had begun to take shape beneath the surface of this small Louisiana town. Ernestine Patterson was born around 1975 and spent most of her life in Jennings, Louisiana. Like many of the women later known as the Jennings Eight, Ernestine's life was shaped by poverty, instability, and a lack of opportunity that defined much of South Jennings. She grew up in an environment marked by hardship, limited jobs, early exposure to drugs, and few support systems. From a young age, Ernestine saw the realities of survival in a town where addiction and crime often blurred with daily life. By adulthood, she was part of the same network of women who relied on one another to get by, forming close bonds with several of the victims who would later share her fate. Ernestine battled with cocaine addiction for much of her adult life. She sometimes engaged in sex work to support herself and her habit, which was a common struggle among women living on the margins in Jennings. Despite the dangers of that world, she remained deeply connected to her family and community. Those who knew her described her as resilient, but trapped in a cycle that offered little escape. Her connection to law enforcement added an additional layer of risk. Ernestine occasionally worked as a police informant, providing information on local drug activity. In Jennings, where trust in the sheriff's office was already fractured, informants like her often lived with fear, used when needed, discarded when convenient. In the days leading up to her death, Ernestine Patterson followed a familiar pattern, moving between the streets near Renshaw Street and Jay's Lounge, a dim, smoke-filled bar where many of Jennings' sex workers and dealers gathered. The lounge was a known stop for quick money, quick fixes, and dangerous company. On June 15, 2005, Ernestine was seen around the area, restless and high, talking with regulars who knew her well. The next night, June 16th, she was spotted again near Jay's Lounge, wearing her usual jean shorts, the ones with the number 24 stitched on one leg, and looking for potential clients. She found one, a man named Larry West, who offered her a place to stay for the night. She spent that evening at his house, and by morning had moved into the abandoned house next door, a place where she sometimes brought clients and got high. The next day, June 17, 2005, Ernestine was seen alive for the last time. What happened in the hours that followed remains uncertain, but the version that circulated among Jennings residents was brutal. When Laconia Muggy Brown, a future victim herself, was later questioned about the killing, she claimed that Brian Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon murdered Ernestine inside the abandoned house. Muggy said Ernestine had robbed some Mexicans, but investigators believe she knew more. According to her statement, Jones slit Ernestine's throat with a hunting knife while Nixon held her down. When Ernestine Patterson's body was found on June 18, 2005, in a canal 5 miles south of Jennings, local law enforcement was quick to take control of the scene, but slow to deliver answers. Deputies from the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office responded to the 911 call made by the frog hunters who discovered her body. Reports later showed that officers took only brief, incomplete statements from the 3 men, failing to record key details or conduct follow-up interviews that could have helped reconstruct the timeline of her death. At the scene, deputies documented that Ernestine was partially clothed, wearing only jean shorts with the number 24 stitched on one leg. A large incision across her neck was immediately visible. Despite the apparent signs of homicide, there was no extensive scene processing, no search for the murder weapon, no forensic sweep of the area for footprints, tire tracks, or discarded evidence. Within hours, her body was transported for autopsy, and the canal site left unsecured. The autopsy confirmed what many already suspected. Ernestine had been murdered. The report listed 3 incised wounds across the front of her neck, bruising on her left hand, and post-mortem damage caused by aquatic predators. Her ETOH measured 0.08, and traces of drugs were found in her system. The cause of death was ruled homicide by cutting instrument. Within days, 2 men, Brian Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon, were arrested for her murder. Investigators claimed that Nixon's wife, Lucinda Cagey, had come forward with a disturbing confession. Nixon told her that he and Jones killed Ernestine with a hunting knife, placed her body in a bloody garbage bag, and left it on her porch for a white van to pick up. Cagey also admitted to hosing down her porch after the bag was removed. At first, it seemed like a breakthrough, but within weeks, the case began to unravel. Detectives failed to locate the supposed crime scene, never conducted forensic testing at Cagey's residence, and didn't recover the knife or garbage bag. By the time they returned to search the location, more than a year later, any potential evidence was long gone. 15 months after Ernestine's death, prosecutors dropped all charges against Jones and Nixon due to lack of physical evidence. What could have been the first solved case in the string of Jennings murders became another unsolved file in the sheriff's office. The investigation into Ernestine Patterson's murder exposed the cracks already forming in Jefferson Davis Parish law enforcement: poor documentation, weak follow-up, and a growing pattern of negligence that would shadow every case to come. Her death was no longer just another tragedy. It was proof that the system meant to deliver justice might have been part of the problem. The case of Ernestine Patterson should have been the moment Jennings woke up. Instead, it became another unanswered file. Arrests were made and then quietly unmade. Witnesses talked and then recanted or were ignored. Physical leads just vanished. By the time prosecutors dropped the charges for lack of evidence, the town's fear had hardened into something else: anger. Locals began to whisper that this wasn't random violence, but a pattern, and that whoever was responsible felt protected enough to keep killing. The silence after Ernestine's death did not last long. Less than a year later, another woman from the same streets would be found in the water, her body fitting the same terrible profile. The failures that followed Ernestine's case made the next discovery feel inevitable, and the questions more urgent. Her name was Kristen Gary Lopez. Kristen Gary Lopez grew up in Jennings, Louisiana, in the same neighborhoods that shaped the lives of the other women known as Jennings 8. She was part of a close but struggling family and was cousins with another victim, Brittany Gary. As a teenager, Kristen drifted into the same social circles that defined South Jennings. Like the victims, she reportedly worked as a confidential informant, providing information about the local drug trade in exchange for leniency on minor charges. This role placed her in constant contact with both dealers and law enforcement, blurring the lines of who could be trusted. Kristen was childhood friends with Hannah Connor, the niece of Frankie Richard, that well-known pimp and drug dealer who operated at the Boudreaux Inn. As adults, the two women remained in contact through that same small, dangerous network of users, clients, and criminals that controlled much of Jennings. Frankie Richard became a fixture in her life, sometimes as a protector, but sometimes as a threat. By early 2007, Kristen's life had grown unstable. She was homeless on and off, drifting between friends' houses, motel rooms, and places like Roxanne Alexander's, where several of the victims were known to stay. Her drug use had worsened, and she was frequently seen with Frankie Richard and Hannah Connor. Friends later said Kristen had begun to fear for her safety. She told people that things were getting bad in Jennings and that she planned to leave town soon, though she never really said why. Those same friends noted that she knew too much about the local drug scene, about the law enforcement's involvement, and about what had happened to Loretta Scheisen and Ernestine Patterson before her. In March 2007, Kristen was last seen getting into a truck with Frankie Richard, Hannah Connor, Tracy Chison, and Connie Siller. What began as another night of drugs and drinking would become her last known hours alive. 2 weeks after Kristen Gary Lopez was seen alive, a fisherman spotted what looked like debris tangled in the reeds of a drainage canal outside of Jennings. It wasn't debris. On March 18, 2007, deputies from the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office recovered a body floating in the Grand Marais Canal. The remains were swollen, waterlogged, and badly decomposed, making the identification difficult. It would take days before the body was confirmed to be Kristen Lopez, the third woman in 2 years to be pulled from the waterways around Jennings. The condition of Kristen's body mirrored that of the earlier victims, partially clothed, decomposed, and found in a remote canal where law enforcement claimed evidence had been washed away. The scene yielded little physical proof. No fingerprints, no usable DNA, and no clear sign of how she died. Investigators listed the cause of death as undetermined, though asphyxia and drowning were considered likely. The discovery drew a familiar reaction in Jennings. Fear followed by silence. Kristen had vanished into the same landscape that had swallowed Loretta Scheisen and Ernestine Patterson before her. For many residents, the similarities were undeniable. Same parish, same type of victim, same canal banks where the town's poorest women kept turning up dead. As word spread, law enforcement promised a thorough investigation. Detectives interviewed Kristen's friends, associates, family, and pieced together her final hours. Within days, their focus turned to Richard and Connor, the last known people seen with her. But behind the official statements and news conferences, rumors began to surface. Rumors that this wasn't a case of one killer preying on women, but of people being silenced for what they knew. Kristen's body was laid to rest that spring, but for Jennings, her death deepened the pattern the town could no longer ignore. The canals had become a graveyard, and the killers were still close. By the summer of 2007, residents of South Jennings had stopped asking if another woman would be found. They were asking when. And in May, the pattern continued, with a woman named Whitney DuBois. Whitney Charlene DuBois, born and raised in Jefferson Davis Parish, Louisiana. Her early life was marked by instability, abandonment, and hardship. When she was just 6 months old, her biological mother, Luella, abandoned her. She was taken in by Ellery and Dorothy DuBois, an older couple who, despite not being related by blood, loved her as their own and eventually adopted her. At around 2 years old, her mother regained custody, but the home was unstable, marked by substance abuse, neglect, and periods of disappearance. After years of back-and-forth custody battles, Whitney was permanently returned to the DuBois household around age 10, She also spent time in foster care and even a Nevada orphanage before her legal adoption by the Dubois family was finalized. Those who knew Whitney as a child described her as timid, slow to trust, and developmentally delayed, the product of years of upheaval. Despite her quiet nature, she craved stability and family. In her teenage years, Whitney began to rebel. At 17, she dropped out of school, moved out, and entered a world already struggling under the weight of drug addiction and poverty. Whitney's life unraveled quickly. She developed a dependency on painkillers and later harder drugs. She was arrested on narcotic charges but tried to rebuild her life after learning she was pregnant while in jail. Her daughter, Beyonce Dubois, was born in 1996. For a time, motherhood gave Whitney a reason to fight her addiction. She moved back in with her adoptive parents and tried to start over, but the hold of addiction never loosened. By her mid-20s, Whitney had become deeply entwined in Jennings' drug scene. She was known to frequent the Boudreaux Inn, and it was there that she fell under the influence of Frankie Richard. To friends and family, Whitney's descent was painful to watch. Her father's death struck her hard. He had been her emotional anchor, and after losing him, she began to spiral. Her adoptive brother later recalled, after Daddy died, that's when she got worse. That's when she started running with the wrong people. By early May 2007, Whitney was using heavily and moving between homes, including that of her biological brother, who dealt prescription pills. On May 11, 2007, she stopped by his house, grabbed something to eat, told her family she wanted to move in. A fight broke out between her brother and Whitney. After Whitney left, her mother discovered that prescription medications had gone missing from her purse. After leaving her family's home on the 11th, Whitney Dubois made her way to Frankie Richard's house, a familiar and dangerous stop for many in Jennings' South Side drug circuit. Richard's place was a revolving door of users, dealers, and sex workers, some of whom doubled as police informants. It was the kind of house where word traveled fast, but truth rarely survived the telling. That night, witnesses later recalled a heated argument breaking out between Whitney and Richard. Accounts differ on what caused it. Some said she confronted him over money. Others claimed he demanded sexual favors and she refused. Several people at the house that night told investigators that Whitney left after the argument, some of which claimed she stormed off alone, while others insisted Richard followed her. When questioned, Richard refused to discuss the visit in detail. He told investigators, "I was on the side of the road when Whitney died. I was getting searched by the police and they still tried to put that on me." He later tried to deflect suspicion, suggesting Mike Dubois, Whitney's older brother, might have been involved. On the morning of May 12, 2007, a day after Whitney Dubois was last seen, Jamie Tron, a man known to have ties to Frankie Richard, called law enforcement to report a body. He claimed he discovered it at the intersection of Earl Duhan and Bobby Roads, a rural area south of Jennings surrounded by cane fields and dirt tracks. When deputies arrived, they found the body of a woman lying by the roadside, naked except for 2 elastic bands on her wrist, one brown, one white. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, despite the short window since her disappearance. This suggested exposure to the elements and possible chemical interference. Her earring was found on the ground nearby. Whitney became the first Jennings 8 victim found on dry land. The coroner's report noted nonspecific bruising on her lower limbs, but no clear signs of struggle or trauma. Toxicology results revealed a ETOH of 0.42, with cocaine and Xanax in her system, levels consistent with a mixed drug intoxication. The cause of death was ruled undetermined, though asphyxiation and drug overdose were both considered. Despite the autopsy's inconclusive findings, locals immediately connected her death to the earlier murders of Loretta and Ernestine. The condition of Whitney's body, the location, and the community she came from all fit a pattern Jennings residents could no longer ignore. As investigators processed the scene, inconsistencies in Jamie Tron's story drew suspicion. The reporter who covered the discovery pointed out that the body was not visible from the road Tron claimed to be driving. This raised questions about how he could have spotted it. Witnesses also recall that Tron had driven past the same area the night before and refused to stop, insisting what they'd seen was a deer. When questioned, Frankie Richard distanced himself, claiming coincidence and blaming Whitney's older brother. He said, "I was getting searched by the police when she died. I think Mike DuBois had something to do with it." His statement did little to convince investigators, or the community, that he was uninvolved. By this time, the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office was facing increasing criticism for its handling of the growing list of female deaths. Families accused the department of apathy and corruption, and once again, critical evidence appeared to have vanished. There were no fingerprints lifted from the scene, no trace analysis linking suspects, and no signs of follow-up on the inconsistencies in Tron's testimony. Forensics concluded that Whitney's manner of death was undetermined, citing mixed drug intoxication and no significant injuries. Forensics concluded that Whitney's manner of death was undetermined, citing mixed drug intoxication and no significant injuries. But those who knew her, and those watching the pattern unfold, didn't need a cause of death to know she'd been murdered. In 2009, while in a drug rehabilitation program, a witness came forward claiming that Frankie Richard had confessed to killing Whitney along with 2 other women. The witness said Richard described using a 50-gallon drum filled with chemicals behind his mother's house to dispose of bodies. No forensic evidence was ever found to confirm this account. Whitney DuBois' death deepened the unease already settling over Jennings. By the time her body was pulled from that rural crossroads, 3 women were dead, each known to the same circle of people, of users, dealers, and informants. The rumors were no longer whispers in back alleys or murmurs in the bars off of I-10. They were part of daily life. People spoke of names in hushed tones, of cops who asked too few questions, and of women who vanished after talking too much. But the violence wasn't finished. Barely a year later, another woman, Laconia Brown, would meet the same fate. Laconia Chantel Brown, known to nearly everyone in Jennings as Muggy, was born January 25th of 1985. Like the others, she was raised in the South Side neighborhoods of Jennings, Louisiana. Her upbringing mirrored that of many others in Jefferson Davis Parish, marked by poverty, instability, and community struggling against the grip of addiction and unemployment. Despite the hardships, Muggy was remembered by family as loving and fiercely protective, especially toward her 3-year-old son, the center of her world. By her early 20s, Muggy had become entangled in the same web of drug use, sex work, and survival that connected so many women in the area. Like several of the eventual Jennings 8 victims, she also served as a police informant. Her cooperation with authorities placed her in a volatile position, caught between the people she informed on and the officers she could not fully trust. Her connections extended deep into the network of those later killed. She was a close friend of Ernestine Patterson, the second victim, and reportedly witnessed Ernestine's murder in 2005, a trauma that haunted her for years. Friends said that since that night, Muggy often spoke of feeling doomed, telling them, "I feel like I got death on me. If anybody kills me, it'll be stymie, and I'll put up a fight." Those fears were not unfounded. Muggy's life intertwined with powerful and dangerous men, both on the streets and within law enforcement. She had been charged in the rape case involving investigator Kirk Menard's daughter, alongside Lawrence Nixon, cousin of Ernestine Patterson. The charge deepened her notoriety and amplified the risks surrounding her. By 2008, Muggy's relationships and reputation had made her a target. She was living on edge, her name circulating in the same breath as local dealers, corrupt deputies, and other women who would later be found dead. Her role as an informant for multiple officers and detectives gave her access to knowledge that some wanted buried. Family members recalled that in the weeks before her death, Muggy seemed paranoid and restless, often saying she was being followed. On May 24, 2008, the tension reached a breaking point. Irvin Edwards, often known as Big Mac, was a local hustler. He stormed into the Budget Inn, enraged over being robbed of $3,000. Muggy's boyfriend, Stymie Washington, pointed the blame at her. Witnesses said Big Mac vowed revenge, promising to hunt her down. In the early hours of May 27, 2008, Muggy made what would be her final phone call to her grandmother. She said she was safe, but pleaded, "Don't tell Stymie I called." Later that morning, she was seen climbing into a red truck with Tracy Chison and Ricardo Williams, an associate of Frankie Richard. Muggy told friends she was headed to the bus station. She had bought a ticket to Washington, D.C., hoping to leave Jennings and start over. She never made it out of town. In the early morning hours of May 29, 2008, at roughly 2 a.m., a Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's deputy on routine patrol turned onto Racca Road, a quiet gravel stretch that led directly to the police firing range. His headlights cut through the darkness and caught the shape of something lying just off the road. When he stopped to take a closer look, he realized it was the body of a woman. The location was startling, not another remote canal or backwater ditch like the women before her, but inside the city limits of Jennings. And it was a place known only to a select few, a dead-end road used primarily by law enforcement. The body was clothed but shoeless, dressed in a peach tank top and blue jean shorts, both discolored white along the left hip, and an ankle bracelet of colored beads still clung to one leg. Bleach had been poured over her body, soaking the fabric, a crude attempt to destroy forensic evidence. The autopsy confirmed a homicide. Muggy had suffered multiple incised wounds to the head and neck, 3 cuts behind her right ear and 7 across her throat, one deep enough to nearly sever it. Her ETOH measured 0.04, and cocaine was found in her system. There were no defensive wounds or other injuries suggesting a struggle, but investigators noted that her throat had been slashed with precision and intent. The brutality of the crime and the choice of location drew immediate suspicion. Her body lay within walking distance of the sheriff's shooting range, where officers trained weekly. Locals questioned how anyone could have dumped a body there unnoticed, especially one belonging to a woman known personally to multiple deputies. When investigators processed the scene, they refused to allow family members to view the body. Coroner Richard DuPont, who handled the case, quietly told the Brown family that he believed law enforcement was involved in her death. He hinted that he knew more than he could safely say. Shortly afterward, DuPont was diagnosed with cancer and died before ever revealing what he claimed to know. The discovery of Laconia Muggy Brown's body marked a turning point in Jennings. For the first time, the violence had reached inside the town itself, onto a road used by police. It was no longer possible to deny that something was deeply wrong within Jefferson Davis Parish. The killings did not stop. A few months later, another woman from the same circle vanished and was found in the woods southeast of Jennings. Crystal Shea Benoit Zeno. Crystal Zeno, known by most as Shea, was born and raised in Lake Arthur, Louisiana, before she later moved to Jennings. Her childhood was marked by instability and early struggles with mental health. Diagnosed at 12 with bipolar, Crystal's teenage years were turbulent, marked by behavioral issues and the beginnings of what would become a long battle with drug addiction. By her early 20s, Crystal had a young daughter whom she adored, but motherhood came with its own challenges. Despite efforts to rebuild her life, the pool of addiction and the cycle of poverty in Jefferson Davis Parish made escape nearly impossible. Crystal's life fell into the same social and economic undercurrent that trapped many of the Jennings 8 victims. She spent nights drifting between friends' homes, motels, and short-term arrangements with clients, trying to balance survival with her worsening drug dependency. She was well known among both law enforcement and the local sex trade, often seen at the Boudreaux Inn. Her connections stretched into the same dangerous network as others who would later be found dead. She was close to Brittany Gary, the youngest of the victims, and had long-standing ties to Frankie Richard. Though Crystal saw him as a source of protection and stability, that protection came with manipulation, drugs, and fear. By the summer of 2008, Crystal's cocaine dependency had spiraled out of control. One of her clients later told investigators all she wanted to do was get high. The same summer, she was kicked out of Roxanne Alexander's house after sleeping with Alexander's boyfriend, losing one of the few safe places she had to stay. Desperate for shelter, Crystal briefly moved in with an abusive client, but fled shortly after. Then in late July of 2008, things took a darker turn. Crystal attended a party where she reportedly began talking about the other murdered women, Loretta, Kristen, Ernestine, and Muggy. Witnesses said she was heavily intoxicated, ranting about what happened to them and insisting she knew too much. Outside the party, a man named Patrick Drake confronted her, smashing her truck window with a metal pipe and striking her in the head. Shaken and bleeding, Crystal called Warden Terry Guillory, a man she knew well, not just as an officer, but as someone she had worked for as an informant. Though Drake was later arrested and died in custody, the incident left Crystal terrified. Friends said her paranoia worsened, and she began moving between Frankie Richard's house and Roxanne Alexander's, never staying in one place for long. She frequently voiced her fear that she would be next, telling her mother, "I knew Kristen. I knew Loretta. I knew Ernestine. I knew Muggy. What if I'm next?" By late August 2008, Crystal stopped showing up at familiar places. Her friends assumed she was laying low, as she sometimes did after fights or drug binges. But as days passed and her phone went silent, her mother's unease grew. Crystal had vanished. On September 11, 2008, two hunters walking near a dry irrigation canal along LaCour Road, just southeast of Jennings, caught the smell of decay drifting through the trees. Following the scent, they found what looked at first like an animal, until they saw the shape of a human form. The body was nude, lying in a shallow depression near the canal. The hunters immediately contacted the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived at the scene within the hour and quickly realized the remains were female. The advanced state of decomposition made visual identification impossible. The body was taken to the coroner's office for examination, but even fingerprints were unusable. Investigators could not tell how long she had been there, though early estimates suggest 2 to 3 weeks. This discovery came just 4 months after Muggy was found murdered, the 5th victim in what was now being whispered about as a killing spree. The Jennings 8 task force, formed only months earlier, absorbed the new case immediately. The sheriff's office confirmed that the woman had been murdered, though they did not disclose a cause of death. It was the first victim found completely nude and on dry land, diverging slightly from the previous bodies recovered from canals and waterways. The autopsy confirmed homicide, but the cause of death was undetermined due to decomposition. The remains showed no clothing or jewelry, and no identifiable trauma could be confirmed because soft tissue had deteriorated. Toxicology tests detected drugs in her system, consistent with the other victims, but the full report was not released to the public. DNA testing would later confirm the body was that of 24-year-old Crystal Shea Benoit Zeno. The coroner's findings left investigators with more questions than answers. Still, the location and timing fit a now familiar pattern. A woman from Jennings' Southside, involved in drugs and sex work, missing for weeks before her body turned up in a rural area on the outskirts of town. The sheriff's office initially released few details. Within weeks, however, 2 people were arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the connection to Crystal's death. Both were later released when prosecutors announced that the evidence was too weak for trial. The details of what led to their arrest were never made public, and the names were not officially disclosed in press briefings. Behind the scenes, investigators interviewed Crystal's acquaintances, including Roxanne Alexander and Frankie Richard, who was known to have been in contact with Crystal shortly before her disappearance. Richard denied involvement, though a 2009 witness in drug rehab later claimed that Richard admitted to killing Crystal, saying he and Jamie Tron disposed of her and 2 other victims in a chemical drug behind his mother's home. Perhaps the most disturbing moment came when Warden Terry Guillory personally visited Crystal's parents to notify them of her death. When her mother questioned how Guillory could be certain of the body's identity given its condition, he reportedly said he knew because of a tattoo located on an intimate part of her body, a detail he could only have known if he had a sexual relationship with Crystal, which multiple witnesses later confirmed. By November 2008, the DNA confirmation of Crystal's identity was announced, making her the 5th known victim in the Jennings 8 murders. No further arrests were made, and no additional suspects were named publicly. Forensic leads stalled, and as with the women before her, Crystal's case quickly went cold. In the months following, the task force issued no new statements. Her death became one more unanswered question in a growing list. Another woman gone. Another promise of justice unfulfilled. By this point, the town was split between fear and disbelief. Officials insisted they were pursuing every lead, but locals whispered that the killers didn't fear the police because they were the police. As autumn settled over Jefferson Davis Parish, the killings continued. Just 2 months later, another woman vanished, 17-year-old Brittany Gary, the youngest of all of them. Brittany Gary, known to her friends and family as Beanie, was born on August 23, 1991, in Crowley, Louisiana, and she grew up in Jennings, a small town already weighed down by poverty and addiction. She was the youngest of the Jennings 8 victims, only 17 years old when she disappeared. Her early life was unstable. Her parents, Brian and Teresa Gary, divorced when she was young, leaving Brittany and her 3 siblings to drift between relatives' homes and temporary stays with their mother. By the time she was a teenager, the Gary household had become transient and unpredictable. Her father later said that every time he came to pick up the children, Teresa would tell him she didn't know where they were. He filed multiple reports with the Child Protective Services, worried about their welfare. By 2006, Brittany and her siblings had run away from home, bouncing between relatives and friends. It was around this time that Brittany began to fall into the same dangerous social circles that had claimed so many of Jennings' women. Like the victims before her, she was pulled into a world defined by drug use, survival sex work, and the looming presence of corrupt authority figures. When Brittany and her mother eventually moved back to Jennings, she started spending time at the home of Roxanne Alexander. Roxanne's home was both the refuge and a trap, a place where she and other women could find food and shelter, but also where dealers, pimps, and clients came and went freely. It was in this world that Brittany met and became associated with men like Frankie Richard. By age 16, Brittany was already using cocaine and dating older men in the drug trade. Her sister Velvet said that after the murders of women like Whitney DuBois and Crystal Zeno, Brittany's behavior grew erratic. She started using more heavily, staying out for days, and growing increasingly paranoid. Brittany told her sister that she was terrified of the police, a fear not uncommon among Jennings' Southside residents who believed that some of the officers were involved in the killings. She also began to talk openly about the deaths of the other women. After Crystal Zeno's murder, Brittany's friends recalled her shouting in Frankie Richard's front yard, accusing him of killing Whitney DuBois. Those who saw her that day said she seemed frightened but defiant, a teenager angry at what was happening to the women around her, yet unaware she was walking straight into the same danger. Despite her young age, Brittany's name was already known to local law enforcement. She was part of the same high-risk group of drug users and informants whose lives overlapped with every one of the Jennings 8. Friends said she was beginning to unravel, reckless, impulsive, and desperate to escape the constant fear that had settled over Jennings. On the afternoon of November 2, 2008, Brittany told her mother she was going to the Family Dollar on South Main Street. It was an ordinary errand, one she had done countless times. Surveillance footage captured her inside the store at about 5:30 p.m., calm and alone. She left the store, turned toward home, and then was never seen alive again. Her mother, Teresa, waited half an hour before calling Brittany's phone. It rang, but no one answered. Within hours, she reported her daughter missing. For 11 days, Teresa and her relatives organized searches with local volunteers, combing the outskirts of Jennings on foot and by car. They feared what everyone in town already suspected, that Brittany Gary had become the next name on an ever-growing list of women gone missing in Jennings. On November 15, 2008, 11 days after her disappearance, the search for 17-year-old Brittany Gary ended, along a quiet stretch of road on the outskirts of Jennings, Louisiana. A group of searchers had been combing ditches and wooded areas since dawn. Around midday, near an overgrown field off of Highway 102, they noticed something pale tangled in the grass. When deputies arrived, the reality became clear. Brittany's decomposed body lay a short distance from the roadway, face down, stripped of clothing, except for a gray beaded anklet on her right leg. Her tattoos confirmed the identity before DNA testing could. The discovery site was roughly 10 miles from where Crystal Zeno's body had been found just weeks earlier, too close in time and distance to ignore. Both girls were part of the same small circle of women, and both had recently stayed at Roxanne Alexander's house. The autopsy determined that Brittany's cause of death was asphyxia, with cocaine and alcohol present in her system. The condition of the remains limited further findings, but the pattern was now unmistakable. Another young woman, another canal-side dump site, another failed promise that the sheriff's department would find who was responsible. When word spread that afternoon, Teresa Gary, Brittany's mother, collapsed outside the sheriff's office. She and other relatives had been searching daily, convinced they would bring Brittany home alive. For many in Jennings, Brittany's death was the breaking point. She was the youngest victim yet, a teenager whose murder made it impossible to dismiss the killings as work of chance or circumstance. The Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office quickly added Brittany's name to the growing list of cases under the multi-agency task force, investigating what was now being called the Jennings 8. Detectives conducted interviews with Frankie Richard, Roxanne Alexander, and several men tied to the local drug trade, but no arrests were made. Officials released few details and urged patience, citing ongoing forensic analysis. Privately, the families heard a different story, evidence misplaced, leads ignored, and investigators who seemed more interested in protecting reputations than finding a killer. For them, Brittany's discovery wasn't just another tragedy. It was proof that whatever was happening in Jennings, it wasn't being stopped. Brittany's death should have been the moment everything stopped, the point when fear finally forced answers. She was just 17, a child compared to the others, and still, the killing didn't end. The task force spoke of progress, of evidence being processed and leads being followed, but the families heard nothing new. As winter turned to summer, Jennings tried to move on, but the pattern was already set. Less than a year later, another familiar name surfaced, a woman who had lived in the same neighborhoods, run with the same people, and feared the same fate. Her name was Nicole Jean Guillory, and she would become the 8th and final victim of the Jennings 8. Nicole Guillory was born in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and raised in the small town of Lake Arthur just south of Jennings. She grew up in poverty, part of a large extended family with deep roots in Jefferson Davis Parish. By her teenage years, Nicole's life began to unravel under the weight of addiction, instability, and the same economic hardships that marked much of South Jennings. She dropped out of school after the 7th grade, never earning a diploma, and soon became entangled in a cycle of drug use, arrests, and exploitation. Her criminal record had begun early and grew long. Theft, burglary, resisting arrest, aggravated assault against a police officer as well, and eventually possession of cocaine, which led to a 20-month prison sentence in 2007. She was released in early 2009, but by then, her dependency on drugs and her involvement in the local sex trade had deepened. A warrant for a parole violation was active at the time of her death. Nicole was also a mother of 4, and while she loved her children, she feared for their safety. In the months before her death, she arranged for them to live with relatives, telling her mother, Barbara Guillory, that it was safer that way. "It's too far gone," she told her. "I'd rather y'all not know nothing, that way nothing can happen to y'all." Her fear wasn't unfounded. Nicole was both cousin and alleged informant for Terry Guillory, who was rumored to have exploited women like her in exchange for leniency or information. Witnesses later claimed Nicole and her boyfriend Michael Prudhomme participated in robberies together and that Prudhomme had sold her to Terry Guillory to reduce his own charges. The line between criminal victim and informant was blurred, especially for women like Nicole, who were caught between the streets and the sheriff's office. By the summer of 2009, Nicole's paranoia had escalated. She told friends she and Laconia Brown had witnessed the murder of Loretta Scheisen. After that, she said she was never the same. Certain that she was being followed and convinced she knew too much, her mother later recalled Nicole coming home to say, "Don't worry about making me a birthday cake. I don't think I'll be alive." Despite her fear, Nicole stayed in Jennings. She drifted between motels, friends' homes, and occasionally stayed with Shelby Jennings, a man she had a long and violent history with. In her final days, witnesses described her as nervous and withdrawn, still using drugs heavily but avoiding the usual haunts in town. On the morning of August 16, 2009, she was last seen alive climbing into a white van with Jeff Daniels, the father of another victim, Ernestine Patterson. After that, Nicole Guillory disappeared. On the afternoon of August 19, 2009, a pair of highway maintenance workers were clearing brush along Interstate 10 in Acadia Parish, about 10 miles outside of Jennings, when they spotted what looked like a body lying on the grassy slope of an overpass. Deputies soon confirmed it was 26-year-old Nicole Jean Guillory. Unlike the 7 women before her, Nicole hadn't been placed in a canal or a ditch. Her body was in plain view, left just off the shoulder where passing drivers could have seen her. The placement was deliberate, almost defiant, a public display rather than an attempt to conceal. She was partially clothed, and the autopsy later revealed asphyxia as the likely cause of death, with postmortem cuts on her left face, eyebrow, and clavicle. Toxicology tests showed cocaine, alcohol, and tramadol in her system, and a vaginal swab suggested possible sperm, though no DNA match was ever released. When word reached Barbara Guillory, she had already filed a missing persons report earlier that day after a call from Shelby Jennings, who hadn't heard from Nicole in 7 days. Shelby told investigators that he'd last seen her between 7 and 7:30 in the morning on August 16th, getting into a white van with Jeff Daniels. Daniels claimed he picked Nicole up, drove her around for 20 minutes, then dropped her off at Ray's Laundry and Cleaners, saying he never saw her again. The discovery of Nicole's body should have brought a swift investigation, but the official response followed the same troubling pattern as the 7 murders before. The Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office, now working alongside the multi-agency task force, conducted interviews and collected forensic samples, but little came of it. Despite the location being outside their parish, the Jefferson Davis task force quickly assumed control, raising questions about jurisdiction and motive. Reporters and residents noted that her case broke from the pattern, the only victim found outside Jefferson Davis Parish, and yet investigators insisted it was connected. Forensics were delayed, chain of custody procedures questioned, and no suspects were ever charged. Even the most basic leads, like Jeff Daniels' conflicting timeline, faded from the record. Privately, those close to Nicole believed her death was a warning. She had told multiple people she feared being killed because of what she knew about the earlier murders, especially Loretta Scheisen's. Her mother's word echoed through Jennings after the funeral. She said she knew too much. By the time Nicole's body was recovered, the official death toll had stood at 8, and the pattern was impossible to deny. 8 women, most tied to the same streets, the same drugs, and the same men, had been found dead within 4 years. Each case followed the same cycle: a missing persons report, a decomposed body, and no arrests that held. Public pressure finally broke through the silence. Local papers ran headlines demanding answers, and residents filled town meetings accusing the sheriff's office of doing nothing. Under growing scrutiny, the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office announced the creation of the multi-agency task force. 14 federal, state, and local departments, along with the FBI, joined what was billed as a unified investigation. On paper, the task force promised accountability and advanced forensic support. In practice, it marked a turning point of frustration. Years of missed evidence, rumors of corruption, and conflicting reports had already eroded trust. The task force entered a community convinced that the truth wasn't being lost, it was being buried. By the end of 2008, public frustration in Jennings had reached its breaking point. With 5 women already dead and more missing, community meetings grew tense, and whispers of police corruption turned into open accusations. Under mounting pressure, Sheriff Ricky Edwards announced the creation of a multi-agency task force, a move meant to restore confidence and centralize the investigation that had spiraled across 4 years and multiple jurisdictions. Formed in December 2008, the task force brought together 14 federal, state, and local enforcement agencies, including the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office, Louisiana State Police, the FBI, the U.S. Marshals Service, and the DEA. For the first time, resources and expertise were pooled under one coordinating command. The stated goal was simple: to find one person or people responsible for the murders now known nationwide as the Jennings 8. The task force promised accountability and transparency. It launched new rounds of forensic testing, DNA collection, and witness interviews, focusing on the theory that the women had been killed by a common offender or connected network. Yet, even as the investigation expanded, internal problems persisted. DNA swabs were taken from investigators themselves amid fears that someone inside law enforcement might be complicit. The results were never made public. Witnesses described intimidation and evidence disposal involving local deputies. Reports surfaced that vehicles possibly used to transport victims were destroyed, and that some officers had direct ties to both the victims and known suspects, including Frankie Richard. For families who had already buried their daughters and sisters, the new task force felt like a last chance, but also a test of whether anyone in power truly wanted justice. While the formation of the task force marked the most significant law enforcement response to date, it also highlighted the depth of the problem. The investigation was no longer just about a series of murders. It was about whether a system built to protect could investigate itself. As the task force took shape, investigators began to map the web connecting the victims. Every name, every address, every hangout led back to the same small circle of people: drug dealers, pimps, informants, and officers who all seemed to know one another. In Jennings, there were no strangers. The same faces appeared in police reports, mugshots, and bar tabs. The women who died moved through that same world, sleeping in the same hotels, buying from the same suppliers, and trusting the same men who claimed to protect them. To understand how 8 women vanished, investigators had to look beyond the victims themselves and into the network surrounding them. It was a network built on addiction, power, and survival, one where loyalty could shift overnight and secrets were traded like currency. At the heart of nearly every lead, rumor, and witness statement sat one name: Frankie Richard. A lifelong resident of South Jennings, Richard was a pimp, dealer, and former oil field worker who had become a fixture in the town's underworld. He ran girls out of the Boudreaux Inn. Most of the Jennings 8 victims had spent time there. Some worked for him, others used drugs with him, and several were last seen in his company. By the mid-2000s, Richard's reach extended far beyond the street. He had ties to local law enforcement, often described by residents as untouchable. Witnesses claimed he traded favors and information with deputies, allowing him to operate openly while others were arrested. He was known for providing sex workers and drugs to men in uniform. When the killings began, that relationship placed him at the intersection of both the criminal world and the police investigating it. Richard's name appeared early in the investigations. He was the last known person seen with Kristen Lopez and was later arrested alongside his niece, Hannah Connor, for Kristen's murder. The charges were dropped for lack of evidence, but the community saw it as another example of power-shielding consequence. Over time, multiple inmates and witnesses accused Richard of direct involvement in several deaths. One claimed he bragged about killing Whitney DuBois. Another said he described disposing of bodies in chemical drugs behind his mother's house. Yet each accusation stalled. Evidence was lost. Witnesses recanted, or records disappeared. Despite the suspicions, Richard was never convicted in connection to the Jennings 8 murders. He continued to deny involvement, insisting the women knew too much and were killed by others to keep them silent. In 2023, he was arrested again on drug and prostitution charges, his life still orbiting the same crimes that had defined it for decades. In many ways, Frankie Richard embodied Jennings itself, a man shaped by addiction, corruption, and survival in a town where vice and law enforcement blurred into one. Whether killer, accomplice, or opportunist, his presence loomed over every case file, every family interview, and every unanswered question left in the wake of the Jennings 8. If Frankie Richard was the muscle of Jennings Underground, Roxanne Alexander, better known as Mama, was its matriarch. While Richard supplied the drugs and connections, Roxanne offered the shelter. Her small home on the south side became a revolving door for women with nowhere else to go. Many of the victims, including Crystal Zeno and Brittany Gary, had stayed there at one time or another, trading chores or companionship for a bed and a meal. Roxanne was a longtime resident, known for her open door and her connections. She knew every woman later found dead, and nearly all of them had passed through her home at some point. It wasn't just a crash spot, it was a hub. Drugs flowed freely, favors were traded, and police informants mingled with dealers. Frankie Richard's name came up often in her orbit. He sent girls to her, visited her home, and kept tabs on who came and who went. After the first few murders, Roxanne's house became a point of interest for investigators. Witnesses reported that Shay Zeno had stayed with Roxanne shortly before her death. Brittany Gary spent time there with her mother, Teresa, in the months before she disappeared. In interviews, other women described Roxanne as both caring and dangerous, someone who helped them survive but also knew too much about what went on behind closed doors. Despite her central role in the victims' lives, Roxanne was never charged or officially named a suspect. Still, her name lingered in police reports, whispered by families and witnesses who believed her home sat at the heart of Jennings' criminal ecosystem. By 2009, the canals had gone still, but the town hadn't found peace. 8 women were dead, and every name led back to the same tangled circle of dealers, informants, and law enforcement. The task force had files full of statements, but no convictions. Families had funerals, but no justice. As the years passed, one question grew louder than any. How could 8 women vanish in the same small town without a single arrest? Theories began to divide Jennings. Some blamed a single predator stalking the streets. Others believed the truth ran deeper, that the real danger came from inside the system meant to protect them. When the first few bodies surfaced, the pattern seemed undeniable. Same town, same age range, same lifestyle. Between 2005 and 2009, 8 women. To law enforcement, it looked like the work of a serial killer. Investigators pointed to the shared details. All were sex workers, all drug users, and many were serving as police informants. Several were found nude or partially clothed, dumped in remote, watery areas, and showed signs of asphyxiation or throat trauma. The consistent victimology and disposal methods suggested a single organized offender. The FBI and the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office both supported this theory. It fit the established behavioral patterns known from other serial cases, an isolated region, a transient victim pool, and a killer familiar with local geography. The formation of the 2008 multi-agency task force was partly based on this assumption, that Jennings was hunting one murderer. At first, the logic seemed sound. The killings spanned only a few years and centered around a tight geographic zone, but over time, the evidence didn't hold. The forensic inconsistencies between victims, the overlapping social networks, and the sheer number of people connected to all 8 women made the single killer theory hard to sustain. Still, for a time, the idea of a serial predator gave Jennings a way to explain the unexplainable, a single evil stalking its streets. It was easier to imagine one killer hiding in the dark than to confront the possibility that the danger lived in plain sight, woven through the town's power structures, its jail cells, and its police force. When the serial killer theory began to crumble, attention shifted to a darker, more unsettling possibility. What if the killers weren't hiding at all? But what if they wore badges? By 2009, too many connections led back to law enforcement to ignore. Every victim was an informant or had personal relationships with officers in the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office. Several were last seen with men tied to the department. The women talked about it before they died, how they knew too much, how they were afraid of the people meant to protect them. Witnesses described officers who traded drugs and sex for information, who used women as currency inside and outside the parish jail. Some of those same officers helped investigate the murders. Deputies were accused of disposing of evidence, including a truck suspected of being used to transport one of the bodies. One investigator, Warren Gary, even bought the vehicle, had it cleaned, and resold it while it was still considered potential evidence. He was fined for ethics violation, but never criminally charged. Others within the department were rumored to have deeper ties. Terry Guillory, the jail warden and cousin of the final victim, Nicole Guillory, was accused by witnesses of coercing and exploiting women inside the jail. The overlap between victims, officers, and known drug dealers blurred every line that was supposed to keep the system accountable. Reporters, including a writer, Ethan Brown, uncovered testimonies from witnesses and former inmates claiming that some victims were silenced because of what they knew about drugs, prostitution rings, and the 2005 police shooting of Leonard Crochet. The corruption theory reframed the entire case. The murders were not random, acts by a single predator, but a systematic elimination of witnesses, a cleanup operation by men protecting themselves and their livelihoods. For Jennings, this was worse than a serial killer. It meant the threat wasn't in the shadows. It was embedded in the badge, built into the same institutions sworn to find the truth. As months turned into years, and the task force kept quiet, Jennings changed. The fear that had once gripped the South Side hardened into anger. Families who had buried daughters and sisters stopped waiting for answers and started demanding them. Rumors turned into organized protests. Local papers filled with letters accusing the sheriff's office of protecting its own. For a town of 11,000, the deaths of 8 women weren't just crimes. They were a mirror. Jennings was forced to look at what it had become, a place where poverty, addiction, and corruption had fused into a cycle no one seemed willing to break. The Jennings 8 murders exposed the fractures of that small southern town in a way few crimes ever had. The victims came from the same neighborhoods, same families, same streets. Their disappearances left holes in homes already marked by hardship, deepening the mistrust between residents and police who claimed to serve them. Public meetings grew tense as families demanded transparency. Activists accused the sheriff's office of corruption. Former informants spoke about exploitation and fear. Each new discovery of a body eroded faith further, until many in Jennings stopped calling the police altogether. National attention followed. Books, documentaries, and investigative reports, most notably Ethan Brown's Murder in the Bayou, brought Jennings into the public eye. The coverage reframed the story from one of serial violence to one of systematic failure, painting a picture of a community trapped between poverty and institutional neglect. The case also changed how the country viewed vulnerable women. It forced audiences to see the human cost of indifference, to recognize that sex workers, addicts, and informants weren't nameless victims, but mothers, daughters, and sisters failed by every system meant to protect them. In Jennings, the legacy of the 8 women lingers. Their faces still appear on murals, vigils, and anniversary marches. Their names remain a warning that justice delayed in a town this small isn't forgotten. 2 decades later, Jennings still carries the weight of its unanswered questions. The canals have long since been dredged, the case files boxed and reboxed, but the silence endures. The task force remains active in name, yet no one has ever been convicted. The suspects have aged, the families have grown smaller, and the truth, whatever it is, sits buried beneath years of corruption, fear, and fatigue. Thank you for listening to Grave Whispers. The story of the Jennings 8 isn't just about 8 murdered women. It's about a town caught between poverty, addiction, and corruption. For 4 long years, bodies surfaced in the canals and swamps around Jennings, each one raising the same questions. How could this keep happening in a town so small? Nearly 20 years later, there are still no convictions. The task force remains, but the truth feels just as murky as the waters were when those women were found. So, what do you think? Was it corruption? Crime? Or a combination of both? You can share your thoughts and theories with us on Discord. Until next time, keep questioning and keep listening for the whispers.